Hello everyone, today we are back with another What If. This time based on a recommendation that I saw in the comment sections of one of my previous videos. I believe it was my What If Marcella Married Robb Stark video, which you guys seem to enjoy, but if you haven't already, by all means go and check that video out, along with some of my other content here on the channel. For now though, the Defiance of Duskendale was an interesting event in the history of Westeros. House Darkland, the House of Steffon Darkland and House of the Dragon, weren't too happy about the state of their city. Duskendale used to be a pretty profitable port town near the Blackwater Bay, but as King's Landing grew, a lot of the business that they used to get slowly went away. So House Darkland refused to pay taxes to the crown and demanded new rights for the city and its people from the king. But when King Aerys showed up to talk about this and turned them down, despite Tywin telling him not to go, he was taken prisoner by the Darklands in an attempt to force the crown to comply with their demands. A lot of people say that the idea to imprison the Mad King was the idea of Lord Darkland's wife, Sarala, a woman from Myr. But regardless of who was at fault, the wife for planting the seed or the husband for nurturing it, King Aerys was taken prisoner for half a year, subject to the torment of his captors. Many say the Defiance of Duskendale is what really turned Aerys into the Mad King, and others say that he was always mad, but the Defiance was just the final straw. But it all came to an end when young Barristan Selmy scaled the walls and infiltrated the Dun Fort, rescuing his monarch. And as compensation for his treatment, the Mad King ordered the extinction of House Darkland, as well as their friends House Hollard, who helped them take the king. But what if Aerys hadn't been so fortunate? What if the Mad King actually died during the Defiance instead of being saved by Barristan? How would the story change? Aerys dying during the Defiance of Duskendale actually isn't that far-fetched of an idea. It's something that could have actually happened, since in the books, when Tywin showed up to get the king back, Lord Dennis Darkland actually threatened to kill King Aerys if Tywin tried to attack the city. Now, would that actually be a move he was willing to go through with, considering that that would make him a Kingslayer and he'd lose his only leverage over Tywin and the crown? It's possible. I mean, he did do the dumb thing and take the king hostage in the first place, so maybe he would have actually gone through with it. In addition to that, when Barristan Selmy was retrieving the king, they were also attacked and Barristan took an arrow to the chest. Who's to say that Mad King Aerys wouldn't get caught in the crossfire and possibly die? So there are a couple likely moments where King Aerys could have genuinely, reasonably died here. And the latter scenario is what I'm going to go with for today's video. Like canon, Tywin plans to attack the city and kill everyone inside, but to avoid a bunch of deaths, Barristan Selmy volunteers to go on a solo mission to retrieve the king. He scales the walls, infiltrates the Dun Fort, kills Simon Hollard in revenge for his fallen brother-in-arms, Gawain Gaunt, and gets the king back. But this time, as they make way for the gates, almost home free, an arrow flies at them. It narrowly misses Barristan Selmy, but to his horror, it nails King Aerys, piercing his heart and leaving him dead as they pass the city gates. With the death of the king, Tywin then orders the sack of Duskendale in retaliation. Now, while Tywin doesn't owe Aerys any personal favors, around this time the relationship had been breaking down for a bit. The death of the king is not something that Tywin can just let slide, since he is Hand. Tywin is a man of his word, and all about brutal displays of power. So House Darkland is put to the sword, but unlike canon, so are the common folk, who were originally spared in the main timeline. Unlike King Aerys, whose anger was limited to the families of his captors, Tywin's wrath does not discriminate. So nobles and commoners alike are all made to suffer. In this scenario, Barristan Selmy would have a hefty case of guilt, since he not only failed to save the king, he also failed to save the city. His whole point of going in alone was to stop Tywin from taking things this far, and that didn't pan out too well. In this timeline, I do believe that Dennis Darkland and his immediate family will all be killed as a result of the city being sacked by Tywin. Afterwards, news would travel around that King Aerys was killed by the Darklands, and after a time, his oldest son Rhaegar would be named king and made the first of his name. Immediately, one of the big things that I think should be noted when it comes to the premature death of King Aerys is that Daenerys is never born. She was conceived some years after the Defiance of Duskendale, and now with her dad dead, she can never be conceived. Her brother Viserys will still be around though, since he was born a year before the Defiance. And if Daenerys isn't conceived, this also means that Rhaela, the mother of Rhaegar and Viserys, gets to live longer, since she died giving birth to Daenerys in canon. I don't think she'd be too torn up about her husband dying though. I think she'd believe it's an unfortunate event, but at the end of the day, he constantly cheated on her and even blamed her for the deaths of some of their children. He wasn't the best guy to her, and while she might feel a way about her oldest son being propelled into power so soon, it would still be a good riddance to Aerys when it comes to his wife. Now, with Rhaegar sitting the Iron Throne, what are some more changes we can see in this timeline? For starters, the aftermath of the Defiance would be different with Rhaegar at the helm. While I did say earlier the extinction of House Darkland, at least the main line, would still happen as a result of Tywin sacking Duskendale, what I don't think will happen is the destruction of House Hollard. House Hollard was loyal to House Darkland when all this went down, and they were even related. Aerys ordered their extinction along with the Darklands, with the exception of a young Dontos Hollard, who was only spared because Barristan Selmy begged for his life, and the Mad King wouldn't refuse the guy who saved his life. With Rhaegar as king, I do believe the family would still be punished, maybe by having their lands and castle taken and given to someone else for their part in the Defiance and King Aerys' death. But Rhaegar doesn't strike me as someone who would sanction their extinction like his father did, so stripping them of their lands, titles, and holdings would be good enough for him. After dealing with the Hollards, Rhaegar would then hear from Barristan Selmy, who wants to resign from the Kingsguard. Now, that might seem out of place for this character considering how much the Kingsguard actually means to him. Barristan basically gave up his life to be a sworn brother, and remained a loyal member of the Guard despite the deaths of King Aerys and King Robert in canon. So what makes him want to resign here? Well, the death of King Aerys. Or rather, the fact that he feels personally responsible for it. Since the incident, the king taking an arrow that was meant for him, he wonders all the time what he could have done differently to save the king. What if he'd been faster? What if he'd been more thorough? What if he hadn't scaled the walls to retrieve King Aerys in the first place and put him in the line of fire as a result? As a member of the Kingsguard, his duty is to preserve the life of the royal family, even at the expense of his own. Yet when he literally held the king's life in his hands, he failed. And as a result, an entire city was destroyed. Nobles and commoners alike, all made to suffer. So with the weight of all these lives lost, he wants to resign, feeling that he's unfit to protect Rhaegar after letting his father die. But Rhaegar is not going to accept this. He tells Barristan that he's always been a loyal and courageous man. He served the crown faithfully and preserved it for years. He's done more for it than anyone else. Like when he killed Meleys the Monstrous during the War of the Nine Penny Kings. A man from House Blackfyre, who wanted the Iron Throne for himself, and would have undoubtedly killed all the Targaryens to secure his claim. In a way, Barristan's actions allow for Rhaegar to even be king today. So while a good act doesn't wash out the bad, nor does a bad one the good. Rhaegar refuses to let him go, and Barristan Selmy remains on the Kingsguard with a promise to never fail again. Next, I do think Rhaegar will reprimand Tywin for his actions at Duskendale, not only killing House Darkland, but terrorizing the common folk as well. Tywin would defend his choice, saying that it was just war and that the people were unfortunate casualties, and he didn't really have much of a choice anyway. House Darkland not only took the king hostage, but they killed him too. It's his duty as hand to defend and serve the crown. Was he just supposed to let the death of King Aerys go unanswered? Now, Rhaegar is a pretty big question mark as a character, so how he would respond to the sacking of Duskendale in this timeline as a ruling monarch is up in the air. But everyone seems to think pretty highly of Rhaegar in the books. He seems to be a noble guy to most people. So I'll say, while he may excuse the destruction of House Darkland, he won't excuse the unnecessary suffering of the common people who were just innocent bystanders. And that's understandable considering the way Tywin wages war is absolutely brutal. His enemies aren't the only ones who suffer. The innocents do too. Taking that into account, Rhaegar wouldn't imprison Tywin, but he will dismiss him as Hand of the King for his actions and name someone else as Hand. Probably his friend Jon Connington, since they were pretty close. Tywin would get moved to a different position on the small council though, since for all his faults, he is an effective lord and served Aerys pretty well for years. He's an asset best kept close. Now, with Rhaegar being king, one of the first things he would have to do is find himself a queen, if he's going to continue the family line. Especially since, with his father dead, he and his baby brother Viserys, along with their mother, are the only Targaryens around. At this point in history, Rhaegar actually isn't married or set up to marry anyone. His relationship and marriage to Elia happened years after the defiance of Duskendale, and the only reason they got married is because of Aerys. Aerys wanted Rhaegar to have a Valyrian bride, and one of Elia's ancestors was actually a Targaryen princess who married a Dornish prince. So she was the best fit for Rhaegar in the eyes of the Mad King. But he didn't actually like Elia despite that because she was Dornish, and the Dornish catch a lot of slack in Westeros. But that's besides the point. With Aerys gone, Rhaegar now has full authority over who he wants to marry. He has a few options for a wife, the most notable of them being Elia Martell, Cersei Lannister, and Lyanna Stark. Elia, since she was his wife in canon, Lyanna because he ran off with her in canon and started a war, and Cersei because Tywin was planning to make her queen for years and asked Mad King Aerys to betroth them. But that didn't work out. I don't think he'll marry Elia in this timeline since that was forced on him by Aerys. I also don't think that he's going to marry Lyanna either. Though she would also be free to marry because she hasn't been betrothed to Robert Baratheon yet at this point, in my opinion, she has no real reason to be on his radar despite everything that happened in canon between them. Sure, he ran off with her to have Jon, but Lyanna seems more like a last resort than anything else. Up until that point, while Rhaegar was obsessed with prophecy and there were obvious implications to his secret match with Lyanna given the Song of Ice and Fire, and them both coming from houses of ice and fire respectively, Rhaegar seemed pretty content with his wife Elia at first. They had 2 children together, and the only reason he seemed to go after Lyanna was because Elia couldn't have any more kids. Both her children, Rhaenys and Aegon, nearly killed her, and they were warned that a 3rd kid probably would kill Elia. But since Rhaegar believed that the dragon needed 3 heads, he pursued Lyanna. So I think as a first choice, it won't be the daughter of Winterfell. What I see happening is Tywin jumping at the opportunity to marry off Cersei to Rhaegar now that he's king, and Aerys is dead. There would be some tension between the new king and Tywin considering what he did to Duskendale, and he would be apprehensive about the match, but I think he would be talked into it eventually, courtesy of Maester Pycelle, Tywin's hype man, and Varys too. He'd see the advantage in the king marrying the daughter of the richest and most feared man in Westeros. Varys would probably tell Rhaegar that it's a wise decision, and that with the murder of the king, the crown needs a powerful political move like this to show the realm that they have some kind of stability going for them. So in this timeline, Rhaegar agrees to marry Cersei Lannister and make her Queen of the Seven Kingdoms in time. We are looking at a very different timeline now. So much changes, so many lives are altered with Rhaegar now being king so early. Because Aerys is dead, something I don't see happening is Jaime being appointed to the Kingsguard. That was a petty move by King Aerys, and Rhaegar has no reason to do the same thing. Even though in the books, in addition to King Aerys, Cersei also convinced Jaime to want a white cloak and join the Kingsguard so they could always be together. I still don't see that happening here even if Cersei is involved. Whether Cersei tries floating the idea by Rhaegar or something, he's not as spiteful as his father Aerys to take Tywin's heir. So, Jaime remains the heir to Casterly Rock and marries Lysa Tully. In the books, Tywin was setting up this marriage with Hoster Tully before Jaime was named to the Kingsguard. Since he doesn't have a white cloak anymore, then Lysa marries Jaime instead of Jon Arryn. With the death of King Aerys, I think this also stops the rebellion too, since the whole thing kind of started because of Lyanna. And I'm not saying it's because Robert loved her so much that he started a war for her, but because she was pretty much the first domino to fall in a series of unfortunate events. Rhaegar ran off with her. Brandon and Rickard Stark tried getting her back only to get killed by the Mad King, who then demanded that Jon Arryn kill a young Ned Stark and a young Robert Baratheon. Jon Arryn didn't like that, so he decided to fight instead. With Aerys gone, this won't happen. Rickard and Brandon get to live. They won't be burned alive. Brandon gets to marry Catelyn Tully, since she was supposed to marry him originally before he died and had to marry Ned Stark. Lyanna probably won't be taken in this timeline, especially if Cersei can give Rhaegar some legitimate children. She popped out Joffrey, Marcella, and Tommen in the show, and even got pregnant with a 4th kid, so we know she has no issue with that kind of stuff. So Rhaegar can get his 3 dragons and maybe more. His Aegon, Rhaenys, and possibly a Visenya too, since he looked to be trying to recreate the original Targaryen trinity that founded the dynasty. And on that note, with Jaime assuming his responsibilities as heir to Casterly Rock and husband to Lysa Tully, I don't see him continuing that relationship with his sister Cersei. So with the twins separated, there is no chance for bastard children. Since Lyanna isn't taken in this timeline, I'll also say that she stays alive too, since she died giving birth to Jon originally. If she never elopes with Rhaegar, then Jon is never born, obviously, so she can live and eventually marry Robert Baratheon. I'll say Ned ends up marrying Ashara Dane in this timeline since he did have a bit of a crush on her in the books, and there's a bunch of rumors about them too. So there are a lot of changes in this timeline, and seemingly for the better, at least for now. One thing that we wouldn't get from this timeline, for better or worse, is the dragons. They only came about because Daenerys went overseas with her brother Viserys. But in this timeline, she was never born. And since the Targaryens were never displaced, she'll never marry Khal Drogo and get the eggs as a wedding gift. She'll also never save Mirri Maz Duur from the Khalasar, who can't poison Khal Drogo as a result, and since Daenerys doesn't exist, she can't burn the two of them to hatch the dragons either. Also, I think Viserys will end up being a different person in this timeline as a result of all of this. It's easy to dismiss him as another mad Targaryen, but a lot of his personality comes from the hardship that he endured during his life. Seeing the demise of his family, the death of his mother, having to raise his little sister by himself, having to live on the streets with assassins after him, and having to sell his mother's crown, the only thing he had left of her, just so he and his sister could survive, damaged him beyond repair. But here, with his family intact, and not only his older brother alive, but his mother as well, we have a better foundation for Prince Viserys moving forward. When he gets older, I think he'll end up marrying Arianne Martell, the daughter of Doran Martell. They were actually betrothed in secret in the books because Doran was plotting a Targaryen restoration before Viserys died. So I think it seems likely here, and we can still get that match between the Martells and the Targaryens this way. All in all, we're off to a much more positive start in this timeline as a result of the Mad King dying early. But at the end of the day, this is just my perspective on things, and you guys may think differently. After all, there is no real way to know what would actually happen in these hypothetical events. For now, though, you guys tell me your thoughts down below and what changes you might have made instead. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more videos, and I will see you all next time.